They say that revenge is a dish best served cold. In my case, it was a dish served rotten, literally. It all started when I achieved my dream at 45. I moved with my wife to a seaside house in a quiet coastal community. After spending 20 years as a chef in busy restaurants, I could finally enjoy the early retirement we had planned. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. Our new house had a small but perfect backyard, and from day one I started picturing a chicken coop there. My wife, Anna, rolled her eyes when I mentioned the idea. "Are you sure? We're in a community, not on a farm," she said while flipping through the stack of neighborhood association documents we received. Before taking any steps, I did my homework. I read all 47 pages of the HOA rules, checked the municipal laws, and even talked with the previous owner. There were no restrictions on chickens, only limits on the number of animals, no more than 4, and on outdoor structures. Legally, everything was fine. I built a neat cedar wooden chicken coop with reinforced mesh, nothing like one of those makeshift builds. I painted it a blue that matched our house and set up automatic feeders. Anna, who had been hesitant at first, started getting excited when she saw the final result. "Not bad, but I doubt it'll last," she commented, less skeptical than before. A week later, I brought home my 4 chickens, 2 golden buff Orpingtons and 2 Araucanas. The Orpingtons were gentle and laid brown eggs, while the Araucanas produced beautiful blue-green eggs. For someone who spent his life in the kitchen, having fresh, organic eggs was like having gold in the backyard. It was on a sunny Saturday morning that I met Margaret. I was in the garden, putting feed out for my chickens, when I felt someone behind me. I turned around and saw a silver-haired lady with her hair perfectly styled, wearing a light pink outfit and holding a clipboard. "Good morning, I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Homeowners Association," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I see you have chickens now." I extended my hand. "Nice to meet you." "Yes, these are my new friends." I checked all the rules before bringing them. Margaret looked at the chickens like they were aliens. Curious. Usually, upscale communities like ours don't allow livestock. "Nothing in the rules forbids chickens, as long as you keep it to 4 and house them properly," I replied calmly. She pressed the clipboard to her chest. "Well, technically there might not be a specific ban, but it definitely goes against the spirit of our rules. People didn't move here expecting to wake up to roosters crowing. They are just chickens, no roosters. No noise, no smell. I promise they're quieter than most neighborhood dogs." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "We'll see. Sometimes we need to update our rules when unexpected situations come up." In that moment, I knew I had made a powerful enemy. Still, I smiled and offered a dozen fresh eggs, which she waved away quickly. 3 weeks later, I noticed something odd. My chickens' egg production seemed inconsistent. All 4 laid almost every day, yet I often found fewer eggs than expected, especially the blue-green ones. "Anna, did you get any eggs early today?" I asked. "No, why?" she replied, glancing over her laptop. "They are disappearing. Yesterday I should have had 8, but I only found 5. At first I thought about predators, maybe a clever raccoon or a rat, but the coop was secure. After monitoring the situation for a week, I decided to install a small hidden camera on the coop's roof. 2 days later, the truth came out. I reviewed the footage and nearly choked on my coffee. At 5:43 in the morning, a familiar figure crept into my backyard. It was Margaret, carrying a small wicker basket and wearing gardening gloves. She carefully opened the coop door, inspected the eggs, and specifically took the blue-green ones while leaving the brown ones behind. I showed the video to Anna, who was stunned. "This is trespassing. And theft. Why is she only taking the blue ones?" "Probably to impress someone. Blue eggs are rare and expensive in gourmet markets." Instead of confronting her right away, an idea started to form in my mind. My years as a chef weren't wasted. I knew exactly how to whip up an unforgettable surprise for our HOA president. First, I set aside a dozen old eggs. I left them at room temperature for 3 days to kick off a process. Then I prepared a lime water solution, an old method used before refrigeration to preserve eggs. But I wanted the opposite of preservation. With a thin needle, I made a tiny hole in each egg, almost unnoticeable, but enough to let bacteria in. I placed them in that solution for 5 days while a horribly stinky fermentation developed inside. The trick was that the hole allowed fermentation while the lime water partially sealed the opening, keeping the contents in, until someone cracked the egg. To complete the trap, I used food coloring to tint them the same blue-green hue as my Americana eggs. After drying, they looked identical to the eggs Margaret coveted. "You sure about this?" Anna asked, holding her nose as I finished the project. "It's a lesson, not revenge," I replied, though I knew it was a bit of both. "She trespasses on our property every morning. She's already stolen more than 2 dozen eggs." The next night, I carefully placed 6 of my special eggs in the coop, strategically positioned to be the first ones seen. The camera was set to capture what would happen next. I didn't have to wait long. Margaret showed up as usual the next morning, but this time she took all 6 blue eggs. I saved the video as proof and went on with my day as usual. 2 days later, the doorbell rang furiously at 10 in the morning. When I opened the door, I found Margaret shaking with anger, with stains on her expensive white blouse and a faint smell of sulfur. "What did you do?" she shouted, completely ignoring that I was at my front door where any passing neighbor could see us. "Good morning to you too, Margaret," I replied calmly. "Your eggs, they exploded. They exploded in my kitchen." Her face was as red as the geraniums in her garden. I was making breakfast for my book club when I cracked the first one. The smell, it was awful. I had to cancel everything. I kept a neutral expression. "Interesting. How did you get my eggs, Margaret? I don't remember giving you any." She hesitated for a second, realizing her mistake. "It doesn't matter. You did it on purpose." "Did what, exactly?" "Leave rotten eggs in my coop. It's a shame that someone snuck onto my property to take them." I grabbed my phone. "By the way, I have some very interesting videos of you sneaking into my backyard at 5:43 in the morning over the last 14 days. Should I show them to the HOA board, or maybe the police?" Margaret's face went from red to white. For a moment, I thought she was going to faint on my porch. "This isn't over," she whispered before turning and walking away. Margaret's threat wasn't empty. A week after the exploding egg incident, I received my first notice from the HOA. An official letter on letterhead stated that my coop violated the architectural aesthetics of the community and had to be removed within 7 days, or I would face fines of $150 per day. I went through the regulations again. There was nothing about architectural aesthetics that applied to my situation. My coop met all the specifications regarding height, distance from neighboring properties, and approved materials. I took photos from every angle and drafted a formal response citing the specific sections that proved the structure was up to code. 3 days later, I received another notice. My hedge was 8 centimeters above the allowed limit. A fine of $75. "This is ridiculous," Anna said as we trimmed the hedge together the following Saturday. "At least half the houses here have taller fences than ours." "It's personal," I replied, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "And this is only just the beginning." Just as expected, the next week brought another violation. Our front porch plant pots were blocking the path and posed a safety risk. A fine of $50 followed soon by another notice that our car parked at the garage entrance was slightly misaligned with the sidewalk. Another $50. The fines kept piling up, each one more absurd than the last. Our mailbox was 2.5 centimeters below the standard height. The color of our house, which was approved by the committee before we moved in, was now inconsistent with the neighborhood's color palette. I appealed every fine in writing, meticulously documenting everything with photos and quotes from the regulations, but all I got were standardized replies: "Your appeal has been reviewed and denied by the committee." The committee, as I later discovered, was made up mostly of Margaret's friends from the bridge club. One particularly hot afternoon, I was watering the plants when a delivery truck stopped in front of the house. The delivery guy brought a large box I had not ordered. Inside, I found a complete home alarm system, along with a note, "You might need this." SP. SP? Anna asked while examining the package. "Sara Perez, our neighbor from the end of the street," I replied. "The lady with the award-winning roses." The next day I visited Ms. Perez to thank her and ask about the mysterious gift. Sara, a 78-year-old lady with calloused gardening hands and bright eyes, invited me for iced tea in her immaculate garden. "It was nothing, dear. I noticed you guys made it onto Margaret's blacklist," she said as she served tea in old cups. 2 years ago she decided my roses attracted too many bugs and tried to force me to remove them. When I refused, someone poisoned half my garden overnight. I looked at her, shocked. "And you think it was Margaret?" "I never got any proof. But I did install cameras afterward." She pointed discreetly to some small devices hidden among the plants. "I recommend you do the same, all over your property." That conversation was eye-opening. On my way back home, a man in his 50s was trimming his lawn and greeted me. "You're the guy with the chickens, right? I heard you're having trouble with our community queen." He introduced himself as Richard, the accountant. As we talked, I learned that Margaret had fined his family for 3 consecutive months because his teenage son left his bike at the garage entrance, creating an eyesore. "Everyone has a story about her," Richard commented as he turned off his lawnmower. "But nobody does anything because she knows someone in City Hall who fast-tracks approvals for the people she likes. And she takes forever with those she doesn't." Over the next 2 weeks, fines kept arriving: $25 for leaving trash on the sidewalk 4 hours after pickup, $100 for excessive Christmas decorations in October, and $75 for excessive noise. Apparently the clucking of my chickens at 2 p.m. on a Sunday was disturbing the neighborhood peace. The situation reached its limit when I received a summons to appear at an HOA disciplinary hearing, where I would face possible expulsion from the community for repeated violations. The document listed 14 infractions in less than a month, totaling almost $1,200 in fines. Anna was on the verge of a breakdown. "Maybe we should sell and get out of here," she suggested one night, exhausted. "This isn't worth all the stress." "That's exactly what she wants," I replied. "For us to give up and sell to one of her friends for a below-market price." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the neighbors that Margaret had intimidated over the years. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but something inside me refused to accept defeat. If I, with all my documentation and evidence, couldn't stand up to her, who could? The answer came when I least expected it. The next day, while taking out the trash, I noticed a younger man watching my coop from across the street. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are those your chickens?" he replied as he crossed over. "My daughter loves them. She always asks if we can come by on our way to physical therapy." He introduced himself as Carlos, lawyer, living 3 blocks down with his wife and his 12-year-old daughter who uses a wheelchair. I ended up inviting him to come closer to see the chickens. While his daughter, Lucia, fed the birds sunflower seeds, Carlos casually mentioned his own conflict with Margaret. We asked for permission to build an access ramp at our entrance. She blocked the request 3 times, saying that it would compromise the neighborhood's aesthetics. We had to invoke the Americans with Disabilities Act to get approval. "That's terrible," I commented, watching Lucia smile as she held one of the chickens. The worst part is that I found out she approved a pool for the HOA treasurer in just 2 days even though it broke the lot size limit. That conversation planted a seed in my mind. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. From that moment on, I turned my kitchen into an operations center. I swapped recipes for investigative strategies. Spread out on the table were all the fine notices, HOA documents, and relevant local laws. I put together a detailed timeline of every incident since we moved in. I needed more information. I started walking around the community every morning, stopping to talk to neighbors, a practice I hadn't done enough of before. At first, people were reserved, but when I mentioned Margaret their expressions changed. Some looked around nervously before sharing their stories while others vented as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. The Martinez family had been fined repeatedly for excessive gatherings when they held Sunday family lunches. Mr. Johnson, an 80-year-old widower, had to remove a memorial bench for his late wife because it wasn't approved by the committee. The Williams family discovered that their request to install solar panels had been lost for 8 months, while similar projects for Margaret's friends were approved in weeks. A pattern began to emerge: the more Margaret disliked someone, the more obstacles that person faced. Even more concerning, there seemed to be a correlation between projects approved quickly and the companies hired. Have you noticed that all the common area renovations are done by the same construction company? I asked Richard, the accountant, as we reviewed the HOA financial reports he had managed to obtain as part of the fiscal committee. Verde and Filio's constructions, he read. They charge well above the market average, but Margaret insists they are the only qualified ones. And have you checked who owns them? Richard looked it up on his phone. His face went pale. Verde and Filio's, the majority owner is a certain James Wilson. Wilson? Like Margaret Wilson. Her son, confirmed Sarah Perez, who had joined our small investigative group. He doesn't even live here. He's in Florida, as far as I know. That discovery was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle. Over the last 5 years, more than $350,000 of HOA funds had been channeled to the company owned by Margaret's son. Unnecessary renovations, premature replacements, excessive maintenance, all approved by an executive committee that rarely met. Carlos, the lawyer, went through the documents and shook his head. This is clearly a conflict of interest, possibly fraud. She never declared her relationship with the company in the meeting minutes. Our investigation expanded. Sarah recruited 5 elderly neighbors who had been watching everything in the community for decades. Richard scrutinized the finances. Carlos looked into the legal implications. Even Anna got into it, creating a detailed spreadsheet of all fines imposed in the last 2 years and identifying patterns of favoritism and harassment. We set up an operations base in Richard's basement, with corkboards covering the walls, filled with documents and photos connected by colored strings, just like one of those detective movies. Every discovery made us more determined. A major breakthrough came when Ms. Perez casually mentioned a former HOA administrative employee who had been fired after questioning some accounting practices. We managed to locate her in a neighboring county. Over a tense lunch in a discreet restaurant, she gave us copies of emails and internal memos that she had prudently kept before leaving. Margaret told me that if I said anything, nobody would believe me and she would make sure I never worked for any homeowners association in the state again, the ex-employee said, visibly nervous. I need this job, I have a granddaughter to take care of. We completely understand, I assured her. Your name will never be mentioned. With this new evidence, we had more than mere suspicions, we had documentation. Overcharged invoices, altered budgets, contracts signed without proper bidding. And more importantly, explicit emails between Margaret and her son discussing how to steer more projects to his company. Our network grew to nearly 20 families, including some disgruntled members from smaller HOA committees. We organized discreet meetings in different homes to avoid raising suspicions. Each new ally brought new stories of abuse of power and favoritism. I realized this had become much bigger than my personal conflict over stolen eggs. We were uncovering an entire system of corruption that affected hundreds of residents. The final piece came from the community's maintenance man, who approached me one afternoon while I was feeding the chickens. I heard you're investigating Ms. Wilson, he said quietly. I have something you might want to see. On his cell phone, there were photos of serious cracks in the structure of the new community center, a $120,000 project completed by Verde and Filio's just 8 months ago. They used subpar materials, he explained. I reported it 3 times, but Margaret always files my complaints away. It's dangerous, especially around the pool area. 2 weeks before the disciplinary hearing where I would be judged for the alleged violations, our group had already compiled an impressive dossier. We were ready not only for my defense but for a counter-offensive that would completely shift the balance of power in the community. On the night before the meeting, we held a final session in my living room. Carlos, in his full lawyer mode, reviewed our strategy. Remember, stay calm and stick to the facts. This isn't about personal revenge, it's about accountability and proper governance. Let Margaret dig her own grave. Anna squeezed my hand as our allies left. Who would have thought that some chickens would cause all this? The chickens were just the catalyst, I replied, watching them through the window as they pecked calmly in the backyard, completely unaware of the chaos they had helped expose. Tomorrow, we're taking back this community for the people who really live here. The community hall was packed like never before for an HOA meeting. Normally, these sessions drew at most 20 residents, the same old faces, obediently approving whatever Margaret presented. That night, more than 100 people were crammed into plastic chairs, with many standing along the sides and at the back. Margaret, sitting at the main table with her loyal executive committee, looked both irritated and confused by the huge crowd. She was dressed in a formal navy blue outfit and her expression alternated between suspicion and disdain. When her eyes met mine, I saw a flash of worry behind her confident facade. The meeting started right on time at 7 p.m. After the initial formalities, Margaret announced the first agenda item, my disciplinary hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to discuss the multiple and continuous violations committed by the owner of Unit 47, she declared without even using my name. We have documented 14 separate infractions in the last month, demonstrating a complete lack of respect for the rules we all agreed to follow. As she detailed each alleged infraction, I noticed several neighbors exchanging skeptical glances. Some even stifled laughs when she mentioned excessive noise from birds and premature holiday decorations. The committee recommends applying the total accumulated fines of $1,275 along with the immediate removal of the unauthorized coop, Margaret concluded. The owner has 2 minutes to defend himself before the vote. I calmly stood up and walked to the center of the hall. I felt every pair of eyes on me. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Before addressing the specific accusations, I'd like to present some relevant facts, I said as I pulled a small remote from my pocket and pointed it at the projector that Carlos had discreetly set up beforehand. Margaret frowned. That wasn't on the agenda. Actually, it is, I interrupted politely. Under Section 5.3 of the rules, any resident may present relevant evidence during their defense. I'm just exercising that right. The first video appeared on the screen, Margaret sneaking into my backyard at 5:43 a.m. stealing eggs from the coop. The room collectively held its breath. This is just one of the 14 documented incidents of trespassing and theft committed by Ms. Wilson over the past few weeks, I explained calmly. Interestingly, they began right after I refused to remove my chickens, which are completely in line with the rules. Margaret's face turned red. She tried to interrupt, but Carlos, positioned strategically in the front row, stood up. As a volunteer legal consultant, I'd like to remind everyone that interrupting a defense violates HOA procedure, Section 8.2, he said firmly. Please, continue. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at first I thought this was just a personal matter between Ms. Wilson and me. However, after talking to other residents, I discovered a disturbing pattern. The next slide showed a compilation of arbitrary fines imposed in the last 2 years, organized by owner and type of violation. It was unbelievable how some people consistently received more penalties than others, with no obvious relation to their actual behavior. As you can see, residents who question board decisions are 430% more likely to receive fines the following month. Meanwhile, certain residents have not received a single citation despite visible, documented violations. I moved to the next slide, which showed a list of every approved renovation project in the last 5 years, along with their values and contractors. This table reveals something even more concerning. Out of the $827,000 spent on renovations and improvements since 2020, a staggering $352,400 was funneled to one company, Verde and Filios Constructions. A murmur ran through the room. Margaret started shuffling her papers nervously. What many don't know is that Verde and Filhos is majority owned by James Wilson, our president's son. The next slide displayed the company's registration, with her son's name highlighted in red. The murmur turned into exclamations of shock and anger. At no point was this conflict of interest disclosed in the meeting minutes or financial reports. In fact, we found evidence that competitive proposals by other companies were consistently rejected without proper justification. I advanced to show photos of the cracks in the newly built community center and an independent engineer's report on the low-quality materials used. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not here merely to contest my finds. I am here because I believe our community deserves transparent and fair management, I said, pausing to look directly at Margaret. So, besides asking for the annulment of all arbitrary penalties against me and other residents, I formally propose a vote of no confidence in the current president based on evidence of conflict of interest, fraudulent management, and abuse of power. Sara Perez, imposing at 78, slowly stood up. I support the motion, she declared firmly. The HOA vice president, visibly uncomfortable, quickly consulted the rules. The motion has been properly presented and supported. According to the statutes, we must now vote. Margaret finally regained her voice. This is absurd. A conspiracy. I have served this community faithfully for 9 years. These accusations are fabricated by someone who keeps chickens, in our respectable community. If the accusations are false, Ms. Wilson, I am sure an independent audit of the association's finances will clear everything up, Carlos replied calmly. Richard, our accountant ally, added. As a member of the fiscal committee, I formally request that an audit be conducted regardless of today's vote. The vote was held by secret ballot to ensure privacy. The atmosphere was tense as the votes were counted. Finally, the vice president announced the result in a trembling voice. With 87 votes in favor and 15 against, the vote of no confidence is approved. In accordance with the statutes, Ms. Wilson is immediately removed from her position. The room exploded into applause. Some longtime residents even had tears in their eyes. Margaret, pale and stiff, gathered her things and quickly left the hall. In the commotion that followed, neighbors who had never spoken to me before surrounded me, each with their own story of intimidation or unfair treatment. The look of relief on their faces made every minute of our investigation worth it. And now, someone asked. Now, we rebuild our community together, I replied. The following months brought a dramatic transformation in the community. An interim management team was elected, composed of 5 residents, one of them being Sara Perez, who, despite her age, showed surprising energy to lead a review committee for the rules. The external audit confirmed our suspicions and revealed even more irregularities than we had discovered. In total, nearly $480,000 had been mishandled during Margaret's management, not only to her son's company but also to consultants who never provided verifiable services. The association hired a lawyer specializing in condominium matters to evaluate their legal options. After long discussions, the community decided to seek reimbursement for the misused funds while avoiding criminal lawsuits that might drag on for years. We want justice, not revenge, was the prevailing sentiment. A formal letter demanding restitution was sent to Margaret. 2 weeks later, she agreed to return $320,000, not the full amount, but enough to avoid a lawsuit. Her house went on the market the next month, and we learned she had moved to another state. The recovered money was reinvested in real improvements, the long-neglected irrigation system was finally fixed, the cracks in the community center were properly repaired, and we even created a small community park on an empty lot that Margaret had reserved for a never-started executive center project. More important than the physical changes were the transformations in governance. All the HOA rules were completely overhauled. Arbitrary or overly restrictive rules were eliminated. A system of checks and balances was put in place to prevent anyone from amassing too much power again. Previous fines were reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and many were waived. To my surprise, I was invited to lead the newly formed Quality of Life Committee, which was tasked with striking a balance between preserving property values and allowing reasonable personal expression. At the end of the summer, we held the first community festival in the subdivision. Neighbors who barely knew each other were now chatting happily, sharing food and stories. Kids played freely on lawns that were once off limits. Mr. Johnson reinstalled the memorial bench for his wife, this time with a small inaugural ceremony that dozens of residents attended. My chickens became a local attraction. I organized a monthly coop tour for neighborhood kids, teaching them about sustainability and food production. Lucia, Carla's daughter, became a regular helper, spending hours feeding the birds and collecting eggs. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as Anna and I sipped coffee on the porch watching our chickens peck around in the yard, she remarked, "It's amazing to think that all of this started because of a few stolen eggs." I reflected on her words. Actually, I think it was all there, waiting to come out. The eggs were just the last straw. Still, she smiled. Who would have thought that 4 chickens could spark a revolution? I took a sip of coffee, enjoying the sound of children playing outside and the chatter of neighbors casually walking about, no longer afraid of breaking some obscure rule. "You know what's even more ironic?" I said. "If Margaret had simply asked for the eggs, I would have happily given them to her. Some people would rather take what isn't theirs than just ask," Anna mused. That week, I found a mysterious envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a handmade card from the local school kids, thanking me for the coop tour. Each child had drawn their favorite chicken, surrounded by hearts and colorful stars. The teacher added a note, "Thank you for showing us that sometimes you have to stand up to bullying to create positive change. You have transformed not just a community, you have transformed a neighborhood." I hung the card on the kitchen wall. Every time I see it, I remember that even the smallest conflicts can lead to important change when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. And what about my chickens? They keep laying their colorful eggs every morning, completely unaware of the critical role they played in liberating an entire community. The coop now proudly displays a small wooden sign made by a neighbor, the cradle of the revolution. Often, when I hand out fresh eggs to neighbors who once were too scared to say hello because of Margaret's constant watch, I think about those explosive eggs that changed everything. Sometimes, the reaction needed to spark change comes from the most unexpected places, like a backyard coop in a seaside community where 4 calm chickens and their stubborn owner refuse to give in to tyranny. When new residents move in, they inevitably hear the story, now almost legendary, about how a retired chef and his chickens took on the authoritarian regime of an HOA president. The tale is told at neighborhood barbecues and school parent meetings. Some details have been exaggerated over time. I even heard one version where the eggs literally exploded like grenades, but the essence remains true. Our community learned that living side by side does not mean sacrificing our individuality or dignity. Rules exist to serve the people, not to oppress them. And sometimes, all it takes to expose years of abuse of power is a few chickens, a handful of rotten eggs, and the courage to say, enough. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. When I tend to my coop every morning and reflect on everything that's happened, I can't help but smile. My blue-green eggs remain the most sought after in the neighborhood. And now, when neighbors want them, they simply knock on my door and ask,